You don't expect a simple paint job to shift the course of your life. I arrived that morning with a few cans of color, a roller, and the usual mindset: finish the task, stay out of the way, and move on to the next house. But something changed in that kitchen. By the time I packed up my brushes, I had witnessed a woman's spirit reignite right in front of me, and I'd come to see my own role in a way I never had before. I wasn't just there to refresh her walls. I was part of something she hadn't felt in 15 years. What began with peeling paint ended with someone smiling in a way she'd forgotten she could. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name's Dean. I'm 34, and for the better part of the last decade, I've made a living as a handyman in a town called Willow Creek, about 2 hours outside of Portland. It's the kind of place where people wave from their porches and leave. Tomatoes from their garden on your doorstep? The jobs range from leaky faucets to full-on renovations. But the one I got that Wednesday morning seemed simple enough. Repaint the kitchen of a house tucked on the edge of Maple Drive, owned by a woman named Nadine. I'd never worked for her before, but the call came through my usual referrals. Her voice on the phone was calm and clipped, but there was something in her tone that sounded almost ... unsure, like someone trying to sound like they had it all under control, even if they didn't. She asked if I could come by to look at the space, maybe bring some swatches, and get started if I had time. I showed up around 9 a.m. sharp. Her house was one of those weather-worn craftsman style homes with ivy creeping up one side and a porch swing that looked like it hadn't moved in years. The lawn was tidy, but the flower beds had more weeds than blooms. There was effort, but not energy, if that makes sense. She answered the door with a polite half-smile. Mid-50s, maybe late 40s, if you squinted. With silver-streaked hair pulled back into a loose bun, and a kind of quiet grace about her. Like someone who used to move faster, but had learned to slow down out of necessity. She introduced herself simply as Nadine. No handshake, just a slight nod and a gesture to come in. The kitchen was a decent-size old cabinets with chipping paint, outdated tile, faded yellow walls that once might have felt cheerful, but now just looked tired. She pointed out what she wanted: done walls repainted, maybe the window trim touched up. She had a color in mind, something between sage and seafoam. She showed me a swatch called Spring Fern she'd picked up months ago, but never had the motivation to act on. I told her it would look great with the light that came in from the east-facing window, and that I could start that day if she was ready. She hesitated for a beat, then said that yes, it was time. As I prepped the space, covering countertops and taping around fixtures, I noticed she didn't go far. Most clients disappear once I get started off to their office, their errands, their own routines, but Nadine stayed nearby, not hovering, just ... present. She made a cup of tea and stood by the doorway, sipping quietly. At one point, she said she used to paint her own rooms back when she first bought the house. That was over 20 years ago, back when her daughter was still a toddler and she and her husband had just moved in. Now her daughter was in college out of state, and her husband's sheet didn't finish that sentence, just trailed off and looked down into her mug like it held the rest of the story. I didn't pry, it wasn't my place. But I could sense there was more to the job than a fresh coat of paint. I could see it in the way she ran her fingers along the old countertop like she was remembering something. I could hear it in the soft music she turned on from an old speaker tucked behind the toaster tunes from the early 2000s. Norah Jones, John Mayer, Tracy Chapman. Music that whispered of comfort and afternoons long gone. Around noon, she offered me a sandwich and a glass of iced tea. That wasn't unusual. Small-town folks are generous like that. But the way she asked, almost like she was unsure whether I'd say yes, made me think it had been a while since she'd had company in her kitchen. I took a short break, sitting by the open window while the paint dried enough for the second coat. We talked about weather, how the summer had come in slow this year, and how the lilacs out back hadn't bloomed the way they used to. She mentioned she used to keep a small herb garden, but hadn't touched it in years. Something about that made me feel like I was standing in the middle of a room that used to be alive with something more than just routine. As the afternoon wore on, the room began to shift. Not just in color, though the new paint certainly helped. There was a different energy taking root. The kitchen felt less like a place she had forgotten, and more like one she was just beginning to remember. By the time I packed up my gear for the day, the light coming through the window hit the new paint just right. She stood there in the doorway, arms crossed loosely, a soft smile barely there. She said the kitchen already felt brighter, warmer. I told her I'd be back the next morning to do the second coat and maybe take a look at the cabinet doors. She wanted them done too. She nodded and said, yes, she'd like that. As I walked to my truck, I glanced back at the house. The porch swing still sat still. The ivy still crept up the siding. But through the kitchen window, I could see her moving around, wiping down the counters, humming softly to herself. And I realized then that this job was going to be different. Not because of the work itself, but because of the woman who had hired me. Something told me this wasn't just about painting her kitchen. It was about painting over something else, something older, deeper, and maybe even a little broken. And if I was careful, if I paid attention, maybe I'd get to see what color hope really was when it returned to someone's life. The next morning, I arrived a little earlier than scheduled. Something about that house lingered in my mind overnight, the look in her eyes as she stood in the newly painted kitchen, the way she hummed like someone reacquainting herself with an old song. I parked on the curb just before 8, and the street was quiet, just a few birds making noise in the trees and the occasional breeze rustling through leaves that hadn't yet decided to fall. I gathered my tools and the second can of paint and walked up the pathway, noting the ivy again. It was overgrown, but not wild, like it had been allowed to stretch without interruption. There was a kind of soft neglect to it, like so much else. Around the house, not dirty, not disheveled, just paused. A life gently suspended. She opened the door before I knocked. Wearing a light sweater over a fitted top, her hair brushed out and falling over her shoulders. She smiled, fuller this time, as if the weight that pulled her down yesterday had shifted ever so slightly. She had music playing again, different this time, jazz standards from the 60s. Ella Fitzgerald and Chet Baker, filling the quiet spaces of the house like they belonged there. She waved me in and asked if I wanted coffee, which I declined. Politely, not because I didn't want it, but because I wasn't sure how comfortable I felt making it seem like this was anything more than a job. But I appreciated the offer and told her so. I got right to work while she stayed nearby again, sitting at the small kitchen table with what looked like a journal in front of her. She didn't write in it, though, just turned the pages every now and then, staring at words or maybe past them. I focused on the brushwork, applying the second coat over the walls, careful to keep my lines clean and even. There's a certain rhythm to painting, especially when you're working in silence with someone else present. It creates a quiet intimacy, a sense of shared space without the need for constant exchange. It was like we were existing in parallel me, bringing the room back to life, or maybe doing the same with something internal. Around mid-morning, she stood and stretched, then walked over to where I was crouched near the baseboards. She asked if I wanted a break, and before I could answer, she opened a tin of cookies and placed them on the table. I said sure and set my brush down, wiping my hands on a rag before joining her. She poured herself a glass of lemonade and offered me one too. We sat in companionable silence for a while, the jazz record softly crackling in the background. Eventually, she spoke up and mentioned that she hadn't had this room painted since her daughter was in middle school. That must have been over a decade ago. She said she always intended to update things, new tiles, new cabinets, but the years slipped by. Her daughter moved out for college, her husband moved out of the house entirely. Oh no. And soon enough, the kitchen became just a place to pass through. It's not one to dwell in. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. She laughed then, lightly, not bitter, and said she didn't mean to dump all that on me. I told her she wasn't. I'd heard more in a stranger's kitchen than most therapists probably do in a week. It made her laugh. Again, this time with less reservation. It was the kind of laugh that fills a space and leaves behind warmth. The kind you didn't expect to hear from someone who seemed so restrained just the day before. She took another sip of her drink and looked around the room, scanning the walls and the subtle shift in light from the new coat of paint. Then she said something that stuck with me. She said, "It's strange how color can change a room and a person at the same time." I nodded, not knowing exactly what she meant, but feeling it just the same. After our break, I got back to painting and she disappeared for a bit. I could hear her moving around the house, opening and closing drawers, maybe looking for something. When she returned, she was holding a small photo album. She placed it gently on the table and flipped through it, then left it open on a page with a photo of her much younger, standing in the very same kitchen. The walls were a pastel blue back then, and she was wearing a red apron, holding a wooden spoon mid-laugh as someone off-camera caught her in motion. She told me that photo was taken the day before her daughter's 10th birthday. They were baking cupcakes together, and the whole kitchen smelled like vanilla and powdered sugar. It was one of her favorite days, she said, not because of the cupcakes or the party, but because everything felt full. Full of life, noise, flour in the air, frosting everywhere, even music louder than it should have been. She paused then, looking down at the photo like it might fall apart if she stared too hard. She said, "Sometimes you don't realize how vivid a memory is until you see what it looks like from the outside." I kept painting, but I listened closely. There was something in her voice that felt like it had been buried for a long time, and only now found the courage to dig its way out. I didn't offer sympathy or solutions. I've learned over the years that the best thing I can do sometimes is just be steady. Let the room breathe. Let the silence speak. Later, as I worked my way around the last wall, I noticed she had placed a vase of fresh flowers on the table. Daisies and lavender, simple but cheerful. I didn't remember them being there earlier. Maybe she went out to pick them from her garden, or maybe they'd been hiding in a cupboard somewhere, waiting for the right moment to be brought out again. Either way, they were like a punctuation mark in the room. A small declaration that this space mattered again. By the time the second coat was finished, the entire kitchen felt transformed. Not just by the color, but by everything else that had quietly shifted in the span of a day. The air felt different, lighter, like whatever had been sitting heavy in the corners had finally started to lift. Nadine walked over to inspect the walls, running her hand along the trim, nodding thoughtfully. Well, she looked at me and said she hadn't realized how long she'd been waiting for this. It's not just the paint, but the feeling it brought with it. Like flipping on a light in a room she hadn't entered in years. I gathered my things, was careful to leave everything clean and orderly. I told her I'd be back the next day to touch up the cabinets if she wanted. She said yes, but she also asked if I'd mind helping her rearrange a few things while I was at it. Some dishes, a spice rack, maybe a few decorative pieces she hadn't looked at in years. I said sure, no problem. It wasn't a big ask. The way she looked at me when she asked it wasn't about the spice rack. It was about movement. Change. About giving herself permission to feel different. As I stepped outside, I noticed a small patch of sunlight falling across the porch swing. For a second, I thought I saw it move, just barely, as if nudged by a breeze or something more subtle. I couldn't tell. But what I did know was that something was coming back to life in that house. Maybe slowly, maybe quietly, but it was happening. Somehow I was part of it. When I showed up on the third morning, the energy around Nadine's home had shifted again, this time in a way that felt intentional. There was something unmistakably different about the way she opened the door, standing a little taller, smiling a little quicker, as if a light inside her had turned on and decided to stay lit for a while. I noticed right away that the porch had been swept. The ivy that had curled like quiet fingers along the railing was trimmed back just enough to look deliberate rather than neglected. A welcome mat that had been crooked since my first day was now centered, clean, and freshly shaken out. It wasn't a transformation anyone else might have clocked. But for someone like me, someone used to picking up on the small, unspoken shifts in a house, it was impossible to miss. She greeted me with coffee this time. Not just an offer, but 2 mugs already prepared, one in her hand and one waiting on the table inside. I thanked her and took it without hesitation. It was still early, and the kitchen smelled faintly of toasted bread and citrus cleaner. The windows were cracked open, letting in the soft hum of the neighborhood, waking up bikes rolling by on sidewalks. Birds gossiping in the trees, a dog barking somewhere down the block. The kind of domestic symphony that somehow made the world feel a little more grounded. She wore jeans and a lightweight cardigan, casual but purposeful. And as we stood in the newly painted kitchen, she asked with a spark in her voice what I thought about adding a small shelf under the window. She said she wanted a place for herbs. Again, basil thyme, maybe some mint. I smiled and told her it was a great idea, then that I'd measure out the space before I left that day. She seemed pleased, even a little proud, and I could tell it had been a long time since she allowed herself to make changes just because she wanted to, not out of necessity. Not for anyone else, but because something inside her was waking back, up and asking to be acknowledged. That morning's task was to remove the cabinet doors and give them a full sanding before applying a new coat of paint. The hinges were a little rusted, and some of the wood had chipped along the edges, but nothing beyond repair. As I worked, she pulled a small stepladder from the pantry and began reaching for things in the upper cupboards. At first, I thought she was just clearing the space to make my job easier, but I soon realized she was doing something more. Editing. Deciding what stayed and what went. A couple of mismatched mugs went into a donation box, followed by a stack of chipped plates and a plastic container full of outdated spices. I watched as she held items in her hands for a few seconds, each as if weighing their stories before making a decision. She paused longest at a blue ceramic bowl, one with a crack running along the edge, repaired with some kind of resin that had discolored over time. She turned it over, looked at the bottom, and set it gently into the keep pile without a word. She caught me watching and gave a sheepish shrug, saying, "Some things don't look pretty anymore, but still carry the memories." I nodded, letting the thought sit in the room like a quiet truth we didn't need to unpack further. While I continued sanding, she took the donation box out to her car, and when she returned, she had a small potted basil plant in her hands. She said she picked it up on a whim the day before, figuring it might inspire her to cook something fresh. She set it on the windowsill, and for a moment the sunlight framed her in such a way that the whole kitchen felt like it was glowing. I asked her what kind of food she liked to cook. She told me she used to host dinner parties once a month. Back when the house was fuller, not fancy ones, just gatherings with a few friends, some good wine, music, and laughter that spilled out onto the porch. But after her daughter left for college and her marriage ended, the silence felt too big. The idea of cooking for just one person became heavy, almost like a reminder of what had been lost. So she stopped. She said she hadn't set the table properly in over 3 years. I kept my hands busy as she talked, just not wanting to break the moment by standing still or looking too deeply at her. But I was listening every word. Not out of obligation, but because. There was something beautiful about watching a person unfold in slow, quiet layers. It wasn't sadness she was sharing, it was strength. The kind that builds over time, quietly, like a root system beneath the surface. As I moved to the next cabinet door, I told her that painting kitchens wasn't usually this meaningful. She chuckled and said that maybe this kitchen wasn't usual either. Later, she asked if I wanted lunch again, and this time it wasn't just a sandwich and iced tea. She made a warm pasta salad with grilled vegetables and a light vinaigrette, served on real plates at the small kitchen table. She had even set out napkins and lit a small candle in the center. It felt more like a moment than a meal. We ate slowly, talked about nothing important: music, old movies, the strange things neighbors do when they think no one's watching. At one point, I noticed she was wearing lipstick, just a soft shade of rose that hadn't been there the day before. It wasn't about vanity, it was about presence. After lunch, I got back to painting the cabinet doors and let them dry in the garage while she cleaned up. As I packed my things for the day, she followed me to the porch. There was a question forming behind her eyes, the kind that didn't quite know how to exit politely. She hesitated, then asked if I'd ever considered helping with small home refreshes, decor advice, layout suggestions, maybe even light woodworking. I told her I did a little of everything and asked what she had in mind. She looked around the porch, then back into the house, and said she wasn't sure yet. But she had a feeling this wouldn't be the last room she wanted to change. She thanked me again, and there was a long pause before either of us moved. That's when her neighbor called out from across the street. A woman in her 60s with a watering can and sharp eyes. She waved and said she hadn't seen Nadine on the porch in ages. Nadine smiled and waved back, saying something about good weather and getting things done. The neighbor gave me a curious glance, then turned back to her roses. Nadine laughed softly and said, "Small towns never let anything go unnoticed." I told her I'd be back the next morning to reinstall the cabinet doors, and she nodded this time, with something close to excitement in her voice. As I walked back to my truck, I looked over my shoulder once more. She was still standing on the porch, looking not at me, but at the house, at the way the light hit the new paint through the window, at the basil plant catching just the right glow. And for the first time, she looked like someone who was ready for more, not just in her home, but in herself. The fourth day began with clouds gathering low and slow over Willow Creek, casting everything in a soft silver light. There was the scent of pending rain in the air, one of those dry-mouth breezes that hinted the sky might open later but hadn't yet made up its mind. I pulled up to Nadine's place just after 8, toolbox in hand and cabinet doors carefully wrapped in the back seat. The moment I stepped out of the truck, I noticed a new planter sitting beside the porch doricata, filled with lavender and marigolds. It hadn't been there yesterday. Each little change seemed to signal something quiet but firm. Nadine was no longer waiting for permission to care about her space again. She was reclaiming it, one deliberate gesture at a time. She opened the door before I reached it, holding a steaming mug with both hands and greeting me with a warmth that felt less like politeness and more like habit. It's like we had known each other longer than a handful of days. She told me to come in, and as I stepped over the threshold, I noticed that the basil plant from the windowsill now had accompanied 2 small ceramic pots with mint and rosemary. Flanking it on either side, the trio sat like old friends catching morning sun, their green leaves gently swaying in the open window breeze. The kitchen itself had settled into its new skin beautifully. The sage-green walls looked brighter with every passing day, and the once muted energy of the room now felt alive, even eager. Today's task was simple in theory: reattach the freshly painted cabinet doors and check the alignment. In practice, it required patience and precision. Hinges always fought back a little when they'd been off too long. Nadine hovered for a moment, watching me unpack the pieces, then surprised me by offering help. She held a flashlight steady, while I worked under the upper cabinets and fetched screws without needing direction. There was a rhythm to the way we moved together in the space, unspoken and fluid. She made a comment about how good it felt to use her hands again, to be part of fixing something instead of just observing it break down. I smiled and told her she had a knack for it. She laughed, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, said maybe it was time she stopped thinking of herself as someone who couldn't start over. As the morning rolled on, a light drizzle began to tap against the windows, soft and intermittent. It filled the house with a cozy stillness, like time had agreed to slow down for a while. Nadine brewed a pot of coffee and sliced some banana bread she said she'd baked late the night before. The smell was comforting, familiar in a way that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with memory. She told me she hadn't baked anything from scratch in years, not since her daughter moved out. It used to be a Sunday tradition: messy counters, too much cinnamon, music playing, flour on their clothes. But life had gotten quiet after that. Too quiet, she admitted. For a while, she convinced herself that quiet was the same as peace. We sat in the kitchen again, rain feathering softly against the roof as we ate. She shared more this time, less guardedly. Told me her daughter, Mel, was studying psychology at a university in Seattle, thriving in every way a mother could hope for. They spoke often, but visits were rare. Mel had been urging her for months to redecorate, to take up painting again, or gardening, or even dancing. Nadine had brushed it off. Not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't sure how to begin again without feeling foolish. I told her that starting small was usually how it worked. One room, one color, one step. She nodded, not saying much, but her expression held a kind of quiet agreement. After coffee, we finished up the last few adjustments on the cabinets. She helped clean the hardware with a toothbrush and vinegar, and I could see how satisfying. It was for her to polish something neglected back to brightness. When we stepped back to admire the finished work, she tilted her head and murmured that the kitchen finally looked like a place someone lived in again, not just passed through. I agreed it was warm, functional, and personal. Every detail felt chosen, not defaulted. She leaned against the counter, sipping the last of her coffee, then looked at me with a strange kind of expression, part nostalgia, part disbelief. Then she said the sentence that would stay with me long after that. Day had ended. She looked around the room, then back at me and said, "I haven't felt this young in 15 years. There was no dramatics, no tears, just a quiet truth spoken aloud, like it had surprised even her. She said it with a sort of stunned clarity, like the realization had only just bloomed in her chest and demanded air. I didn't say anything right away. I didn't need to. The way she smiled afterward, soft and a little vulnerable, said everything. It wasn't about years or looks or pretending to be who she used to be. It was about feeling something she thought had vanished: liveness, curiosity, a flicker of joy that didn't need to be justified. That moment, the way her voice carried it, the way she stood in the kitchen like she owned it, again felt like the true beginning of something. We didn't linger on it. She moved past the moment with grace, asking if I could help her install that small shelf under the window for the herbs. I agreed, taking the measurements and promising to bring the right brackets tomorrow. She mentioned maybe painting some old chairs she had in the garage, turning them into something cheerful, maybe even mismatched on purpose. I told her mismatched was in style, and that the bolder the better. That made her laugh again, and this time she didn't stop herself. As I packed up for the day, she stood on the porch holding the doorframe like she was anchoring herself in something solid. She asked how long projects like this usually took, and I told her every home was different. Every story took its own time. Then she asked if I'd like to join her for dinner sometime, not as payment, just as thanks. Said she was going to try one of her old recipes, and it might be nice to have someone to share it with. I said yes before I had time to think about whether I should. There was something about her that made you want to say yes, not out of obligation, but because it felt like you'd miss something rare if you didn't. As I walked back to my truck, the rain had eased to a mist, and the street glistened under the filtered light. The air smelled of wet earth and blooming things, and I realized, with no small measure of awe, that the most powerful changes don't come with fireworks. They come in small gestures: a new plant, a painted wall, an open door. They come when someone who forgot how to feel young suddenly does, and not because of anything you said, but simply because you stayed long enough to listen. The next morning, the rain had passed and left behind that washed-clean feeling in the air. The sky was a brilliant pale blue, and the leaves along Nadine's street shimmered with droplets that hadn't yet evaporated. It was the kind of morning that felt like a blank slate, and as I pulled up to her house, I could already tell she'd embraced that energy. The porch now had a second planter beside the first, and the swing had been dusted off. Cushions added nothing elaborate, just enough to show someone had started caring about comfort again. She met me at the door. Not with coffee this time, but with a half-laugh, saying she'd been rearranging things all morning and probably moved the same lamp 5 times trying to get the angle right. I told her that was the surest sign a space was finally waking up. Inside, the kitchen was glowing. The plants on the windowsill had been joined by a tiny ceramic sun sculpture that looked handmade. The shelf under the window was up now, brackets, secured and lined with fresh herbs and small decorative jars. Nadine had added a thin white curtain above the sink and a runner rug beneath the counter. It all looked ... lived in. Not like a catalog or a Pinterest board, but like a place that had seen life and was ready to welcome more. She told me the rug was something she'd kept rolled up in a hall closet for years, thinking she'd never have a reason to use it again. She said she'd never thought it would suit the house until the kitchen started looking like this. I said, maybe the house just needed her to remember who she was before it could show her who she still could be. Brought in the shelf brackets and the sanded wooden boards we planned to use to create a couple more custom fixtures around the kitchen, just simple woodwork. but enough to keep me busy and help her continue transforming the space. She was more involved this time, standing close while I drilled, offering to hold things in place, making sure everything was level, even when I teased her that I had a good eye for it. She said she wanted to be part of the process, not just the one watching. That stuck with me more than she probably intended. Most people don't realize they've stepped out of their own lives until they decide to step back in, while we worked. She told me about a conversation she'd had with her daughter the night before. Mel had FaceTimed her, noticed the new kitchen wall color in the background, and said, "Wait, Mom, did you finally paint?" Nadine had smiled and told her yes, and then explained the whole process, even showing off the plants and the new shelves. She said Mel got quiet for a second, then smiled wide and said she was proud of her. That single comment lit something up in Nadine that even the new sunlight couldn't match. She told me it had been a long time since someone told her they were proud of her for something she did just for herself. We took a short break once the shelves were up. I found myself once again seated at her kitchen table, drinking from the same ceramic mugs that now felt like markers of continuity. She served us both a cold fruit salad she'd made that morning, and while we ate, she admitted something. She said she'd been terrified to let anyone into her home before this week. Not because of the mess or the memories, but because letting someone in meant acknowledging how long she'd kept things paused. She said my presence, gentle, steady, non-invasive, made it possible for her to shift that fear into something useful. I told her she had done the hardest part herself, deciding to let things change. After lunch, she led me into the living room, asking if I wouldn't mind helping move some furniture. She wanted to rotate the couch, pull the rug out from under a forgotten coffee table, and maybe bring more light into the space. I agreed, of course. The living room was darker than the kitchen, more shaded and filled with heavy furniture that hadn't moved in years, so I helped her lift and slide pieces into new positions. Dust rose from underneath like ghosts being evicted. She laughed when she found an old TV remote and a missing earring buried behind the armrest. She said this room used to be the hub of her social life: game nights, movie marathons, winter evenings with mulled wine and popcorn. She wanted to reclaim that. She wanted the house to feel like it belonged to her again, not to the shadows of who she used to be. Bit by bit, the living room took on a new life. It wasn't just about cleaning or organizing, it was about permission, giving herself permission to change what no longer served her. As we stood back to assess the space, she mentioned she'd been thinking about getting a record player. She had all her old records in the attic, and maybe it was time to bring them back down. I told her I knew someone who restored vintage record players. She lit up like I'd just offered her a key too, another version of herself she hadn't seen in years. The afternoon passed gently. I finished touching up the last of the shelves in the kitchen and swept out the dust from the living room. Nadine disappeared briefly and returned with a small canvas, one she said she painted years ago and had never hung. It was abstract warm colors, sweeping brushstrokes, not refined but expressive. She asked what I thought, and I told her it looked like movement, like something coming back to life. She smiled and placed it above the mantel, then stepped back and tilted her head. "Maybe I'll paint again," she said, not to me, but to the room. As I packed up to leave, the light outside had softened into that golden hour warmth. The whole house seemed to glow from the inside out. Nadine followed me out to the truck, her arms folded loosely across her chest like someone content but still catching up to the feeling. She thanked me, not just for the work, but for the presence. She said it like it mattered, like it was rare. Before I left, she handed me a folded piece of paper. It was a list of her own ideas for what to do next. Some rooms to refresh, a couple of small repairs, and at the bottom, start painting again. Not walls, canvases. She said she wasn't sure yet how serious she was, but it helped to write it down. Told her that writing things down was how most beginnings start. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw her standing in the doorway, the porch light casting a halo around her. She waved once, then turned and walked back inside. Not slowly, not hesitantly, but with the sure-footedness of someone who had re-entered her life on her own terms. And I realized then that sometimes the simplest acts: fresh paint, rearranged furniture, a few shared meals can become a lifeline. Not because they fix everything, but because they remind someone that they're still capable of change, of laughter, feeling young not in age, but in spirit. The next day brought a quiet kind of anticipation, the kind that hums just beneath the surface when you don't quite know what's coming, but you can feel that something is building. I arrived at Nadine's place earlier than usual, sure whether I was drawn by the work itself or the rhythm we've built over the last few days. Her house was slowly becoming something different, less a shell and more a living extension of her. Even the garden beds out front had been cleared of weeds. A bag of soil leaned against the porch railing like a promise waiting to be kept. When she opened the door, I could tell right away that something had shifted, not in a dramatic way, but in that subtle, internal realignment that shows in a person's eyes before their words catch up. She wore a pale yellow blouse, sleeves rolled just above her elbows, and her hair was loosely clipped back, strands falling naturally around her face. There was color in her cheeks that hadn't been there a week ago, and as she welcomed me in, I noticed the scent of something fresh, and faintly sweet, maybe lemon or verbena lingering in the air. The house didn't just look different anymore, felt different. Lighter, more open, like it had been waiting for someone to breathe life back into its corners. Today's task was relatively simple: repainting the small breakfast nook table and sanding down a bench that had been tucked away in the laundry room for years. She wanted it all to match the new feel of the kitchen, a soft sage green with worn edges to keep it from looking too pristine. But before we got to work, she asked if I had time to sit for a minute. There was coffee, she said, and a few scones she'd picked up from the bakery in town. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, sunlight pooling through the window and painting golden stripes across the wood. As we sipped coffee, she reached under a napkin and pulled out a folded photograph. It was slightly faded, clearly well handled, but still sharp enough to make out the details. It was her and her daughter, standing outside this very house on the day they'd moved in. The teen looked younger, livelier, with her arm around a grinning teenage girl who held a box labeled books. The front porch looked almost exactly the same as it had before we started, cluttered, weathered, tired, but their expressions were full of hope. She stared at the photo for a moment, then handed it to me without a word. I took it, studying their smiles, the way they leaned into each other. Nadine told me that photo had been stuck to the fridge for a long time, until one day she took it down. Not because she didn't want to remember, but because it had started to feel like a reminder of everything that changed too quickly. Her marriage ending, her daughter leaving, the silence that followed. She said she wasn't sure why she felt ready to look at it again now, but that something about the kitchen being full again of color, of plants, of noise, made her feel like it belonged out in the open once more, not hidden in a drawer or an album. We finished our coffee and moved to the sunroom, where the old bench waited like a forgotten memory. She told me it had once been her husband's favorite spot to sit with the morning paper. She had considered giving it away more than once, but something always stopped her. "It's strange," she said, "how you can miss something without wanting it back." I nodded, understanding more than I let on. Grief isn't always about longing. Sometimes it's just about honoring what was, while still moving forward. We sanded the bench together. She took one end while I worked on the other, and the sound of the paper dragging across would fill the room with a kind of meditative rhythm. We didn't speak much during it, but we didn't need to. Her movements were steady, deliberate. She wasn't fragile, not in the way people often assume about women who've lived through heartache. She was composed, patient, reclaiming pieces of her life with quiet determination. Once it was smooth and dusted, we carried it back into the kitchen and positioned it beneath the window, beside the table. Ran her hand along the edge, inspecting the grain, and then smiled, soft, real, grounded. That moment felt heavier than the task itself, like placing the bench was less about furniture and more about closure. She turned to me and said it was strange how sometimes fixing old things made you feel new again. I agreed and told her that's probably why I liked this kind of work in the first place. By early afternoon, we'd painted the table, left it to dry, and cleaned up the last of the tools. I was ready to leave, but Nadine stopped me at the door. She said she'd been thinking about what it would mean to really let someone back into her world, not just as a friend or a guest, but as a regular presence. She looked me in the eye when she said it, and the vulnerability there was unmistakable. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even a request. It was more like an opening, a window cracked just wide enough to let light in if someone wanted to step through. I didn't say much in response. I simply told her I'd be back the next day, that we could start planning the next project on her listry, painting the hallway, or maybe tackling the small back deck if the weather held. She nodded, visibly relieved, not to have turned the moment into anything more or less than it was. Before I stepped off the porch, she added something with a quiet laugh. Said she'd been listening to music again, and the night before she danced alone in the kitchen to an old Billie Holiday record she hadn't touched in years. She said it felt silly at first, but then it didn't. That image stayed with me as I drove away, the thought of her barefoot, humming softly to herself as she swayed through the kitchen, paint on her hands, music in the air, and something long dormant waking up inside her. Not for anyone else. It's not for approval. It's just for her. And I realized then that healing doesn't always look like therapy or milestones. Sometimes it looks like scones and photographs. Sometimes it's a bench you almost gave away. And sometimes it's a woman dancing alone in her kitchen, remembering that joy was never a thing she had to earn. It was always hers to rediscover. The seventh morning began a little differently. Nadine texted me just after sunrise, saying, "Take your time this morning. The paint's still drying, and I'm making something special." That message carried a tone I hadn't heard from her yet, something playful, something light. It was a far cry from the hesitant, reserved woman I first met standing behind her partially open front door. I followed her suggestion and gave her a bit more time before heading over, using the extra minutes to grab some supplies we might need for whatever she had in mind next. Something told me she was beginning to think ahead in ways she hadn't before, and I didn't want to arrive empty-handed if the day turned into something unexpected. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I was greeted by music playing softly from inside classic jazz, something smooth and warm that wafted through the slightly cracked kitchen window. The moment I knocked, Nadine opened the door, wearing a wide smile and a flour-dusted apron. "I hope you like blueberry pancakes," she said, waving me inside with the kind of casual confidence that only comes when someone is starting to feel at home again. It's not just with their space, but within themselves. The kitchen looked as it had the day before, only now it was alive with activity batter bowls, fruit scattered across the counter, a skillet already sizzling on the stove. She moved easily through the space, humming along with the music, flipping pancakes, and gesturing toward the fresh pot of coffee on the counter like it was part of some well-rehearsed morning ritual. It was clear she'd woken up with energy, maybe even excitement. As I poured myself a cup, she set a plate in front of me with a stack of golden pancakes topped with sliced bananas and a drizzle of honey. "I couldn't sleep last night," she admitted. "I kept thinking about what you said, how fixing old things can make you feel new. I guess I'm trying to lean into that." We sat at the table eating in that easy silence that only comes when two people are comfortable in each other's company. Between bites, she told me that after I left the night before, she spent hours going through old boxes in her closet. Not to reminisce, she said, but to clear space. It's literal and emotional. She found letters, trinkets, a few broken things she'd kept, simply because she didn't know what to do with them. It felt good to toss some of it, she said. Not everything has to be carried forever. I nodded, understanding more than I let on. We both let that truth settle between us like a shared secret. After breakfast, she led me down the hallway to the room at the very end, one I hadn't seen yet. She said, pushing the door open slowly, "Used to be my art room." The moment I stepped inside, I could tell it had once held a different kind of energy. The windows were large and filled the space with natural light. And although it had become something of a storage space in recent years, there were still signs of what it used to be. An easel draped with a faded sheet, a shelf filled with unopened paints, a sketchpad on the floor with the corner of a drawing peeking out. She stood in the doorway like someone peering into a memory, arms crossed loosely, expression unreadable. I haven't painted since the divorce, she said quietly. Pointless after a while, like, who was I creating for? She walked over to the covered easel and peeled the sheet away. Underneath was a half-finished canvas, bold, swirls of orange and blue, a kind of storm in motion. She stared at it for a long moment before turning to me and asking, "Do you think it's silly for someone my age to start again?" It was the kind of question that didn't need a lecture or a pep talk, just honesty. So I said what I knew. To be true, that age had nothing to do with starting, and everything to do with knowing how precious the act itself was. I told her that not painting all these years hadn't erased her talent or her right to create. It just meant the next chapter would be written with different hands, wiser, steadier, and maybe even braver. That seemed to land with her. She didn't say anything more about it, but I noticed the way her hand brushed lightly across the edge of the canvas, like reconnecting with an old friend. I asked if she wanted help setting up the space against just organizing. Nothing big. She smiled, nodded, and together we began to clear the room. Moved boxes, folded up old linens, and repurposed a few forgotten pieces of furniture into storage. With every item we relocated, the room breathed a little easier. Dust motes caught in the sunlight like sparks of possibility, and by the time we finished, the space looked ready to be used again, not someday, but now. Later that afternoon, we sat on the floor of that art room with the windows open and the scent of fresh air mixing with old memories. Nadine had pulled out her sketchbook, flipping through pages that held rough outlines, quick strokes, notes in the margins. Some were dated, others not, but all of them carried her fingerprints, her voice. "I forgot how much I missed this," she said more to herself than to me. It was like part of me was packed away with everything else. She tapped the sketchbook once, then looked at me with something quiet but certain in her eyes. "I think I'm going to paint again." As the day wound down, we made our way back to the kitchen, where the late afternoon light stretched long across the floor. Nadine offered me another cup of coffee, and we stood by the window in silence, watching the breeze ripple through the curtains. She asked if I ever thought about doing something different, stepping away from the handyman life. I told her that I used to think about it all the time, back when I believed I had to climb some imagined ladder of success. But somewhere along the way, I realized that what I do walking into people's lives at their most uncertain moments, helping them rebuild not just walls but confidence, was more fulfilling than anything I could have planned. She considered that for a moment, then said softly, "Maybe that's what I need to do too. Not plan everything, just ... follow where the spark goes." I left not long after that, but not before she handed me a list not like the one before, full of repairs and tasks. This one was different, short, personal. At the top, it read, "Things I want to try again." Painting was number 1. Hosting dinner for friends was second. Third was dancing in public, which she said with a sheepish grin might take more time. But at the bottom, circled twice, was this: "Feel proud of myself." Again. That line stuck with me the whole drive home, because it wasn't about vanity. It wasn't about accomplishments. It was about finding your way back to yourself after years of detours. And that, more than any transformation I could make with a drill or a paintbrush, was the real work that mattered. By the time I returned the next day, the weather had taken a softer turn. There was a quiet breeze moving through the trees. The sky hung low with clouds that weren't heavy enough to threaten rain, but mellow enough to calm the heat that had lingered for days. Nadine was already outside when I arrived, sitting on the porch steps with a large mug of something warm between her hands. Her knees tucked close like she'd been deep in thought for a while before I pulled up. She looked peaceful in a way that wasn't forced, no longer trying to look composed or pulled together, but simply comfortable in her own skin. She stood up slowly as I approached, stretching her arms behind her back with a small smile, and asked me if I wanted to help her with something a little more creative than usual. I said yes before she even finished the sentence. She led me back into the art room, which now felt like it had always been part of the home, rather than a forgotten relic. The windows were cracked open, and the faint sound of wind chimes from somewhere down the street filtered in on the breeze. Single canvas stood ready on the easel blank, but not intimidating, like it was waiting patiently for its turn. She had a tray of paints laid out on a folding table, brushes arranged in size order, and a small stack of rags beside them. Everything looked prepared, but nothing felt precious. It was a space made for trying, not for perfection. "I want to paint something today," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, even though they weren't dirty, "but I want you to help." I paused for a second, unsure if she meant to have me physically paint with her, or simply stand nearby and keep her company. But then she handed me a brush, grinned, and told me not to overthink it. "Let's just make something messy," she said, "just to see what happens." So we started. We dipped into colors, passed brushes back and forth, added lines and smudges without any real plan. She chose bold colored sunset oranges, sea glass greens, and deep purples, and I followed suit. Working more slowly, more carefully, but still, with an openness I hadn't felt since I was a kid. Every now and then she'd lean back, tilt her head, and say something like, "Too much here," or "Should we add more light there?" But there were no real rules, just motion, just layers, just a process. Time passed quickly, and before long the canvas was no longer blank, but alive with energy. Swirls, streaks, textures. It didn't look like anything specific, but it felt like something had been said, like something unspoken had finally found its form. At one point, she stepped back, hands on her hips, breathing a little heavier than before, and said, "You know, I used to think I had to be good at something for it to count. But this just feels like being human." I understood that sentiment all too well. Most of us spend so much time trying to meet the bar we imagine that we forget the value in simply showing up for the things that light us up. I told her I thought it was beautiful, not the painting specifically. Though it did hold something raw and captivating, but the whole act of it, of choosing creation over silence. After we cleaned up, she poured us both glasses of lemonade and suggested we sit on the back deck to rest for a bit. The yard behind her house was a little wild grass, slightly overgrown, bushes in need of trimming, but it wasn't unruly. It felt free, like nature was stretching out after being ignored for too long. She told me she used to sit out here every Sunday morning and sketch whatever caught her attention: birds, shadows, flowers pushing up through the cracks in the concrete. "I stopped when it got too quiet," she admitted. "Too many memories, not enough noise." I asked if she'd thought about sketching again. She nodded, almost sheepishly, and said she already had. Just the night before, she'd taken her sketchpad and a glass of wine and sat right where we were now, drawing the outline of the broken fence at the far end of the yard. "It's not perfect," she said, "but I realized it doesn't need to be. I just needed to see if I could still do it." That vulnerability, simple, brave, unguarded, was more powerful than anything we could have painted that morning. As we sat there watching the wind dance through the trees, she asked me if I ever missed anything. Not people or places, but pieces of myself, versions that once existed but somehow slipped away. It was such an unexpected question that I had to think for a moment. I told her I sometimes missed how carefree I was when I first started working with my hands, before it became my livelihood. Back then, every job felt like a discovery. Every nail hammered was a small act of creation, not obligation. Over time, it had turned into work, honest, fulfilling work, but it had lost some of the wonder. She nodded slowly, understanding, and said she felt that way about painting. How it used to feel like play and then became tangled with expectations and judgment until it was easier to stop than to face her own imagined failures. But lately, she said, I think I'm starting to forgive myself for quitting. And I'm starting to trust that it's okay to begin again. That afternoon, as we sat in silence, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the creak of the wooden deck beneath us, I realized something that had been forming slowly over the last few days. This wasn't just about helping a woman paint her kitchen or reorganize her home. It was about standing witness to someone reclaiming themselves piece by piece, watching her step into the light after years of shadow, not because anyone pushed her, because she chose to. When I finally got up to leave, she didn't walk me to the door this time. She stayed seated, sketchpad in her lap, pencil in hand, a faint smile on her lips. See you tomorrow, she said, not even looking up. And I believed her. Because this time, it wasn't just about the next task. It was about the rhythm we'd found. The quiet companionship, shared momentum of two people gently reminding each other that it's never too late to feel like yourself. Again, as I drove off, I couldn't help but feel like the story we were writing through paint and conversation. Through sketchbooks and coffee mugs was only just beginning. It's not a love story in the usual sense, but a story about restoration. It's about mutual presence. About the bravery it takes to start over, not just once, but as many times as it takes. The 9th day brought a quiet shift in the way things felt between us. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but rather like something had finally settled into place. There was an ease, a familiarity that had taken root. I arrived at Nadine's just as the early morning sun filtered through the canopy of trees lining her street. The house, now a patchwork of progress, had slowly begun to reflect the change in its owner, a little brighter, a little more lived in, like the walls themselves were starting to breathe again. She greeted me with that same half-smile she'd worn the day before, but this time her eyes held a new softness. Like she wasn't trying so hard anymore to guard whatever had been fragile inside her. Today wasn't about fixing anything. She told me she wanted to show me something instead. She led me out back again, past the uneven stone path and the rust-stained garden bench, to a side shed I hadn't noticed before. It was small, wooden, and partially hidden by a leaning lilac bush that had grown wild over the years. Nadine tugged open the warped door, revealing a dusty interior filled with old tools, broken pots, tangled string lights, and forgotten decor from holidays long past. This, she said, was supposed to be my retreat once. She stepped inside, her voice echoing slightly in the small space. After the divorce, I thought maybe I'd turn it into an art shed. Somewhere I could paint, read, just breathe. But then I stopped believing I deserved that kind of peace. She glanced back at me as if gauging whether I understood. I did. She pointed to the wooden planks lining the back wall. I bought all the paint and supplies, even got halfway through, clearing it out, but then, one day, I just stopped. And I locked the door. Her tone wasn't bitter, just reflective, like she was watching a movie of her past play out in silence. It sat like this for almost 6 years, she said. Sometimes I'd walk past it and think, maybe next weekend, but then another year would go by. I stepped inside with her, ducking slightly beneath the sagging doorway. The air smelled like wood and Timothy untouched. Waiting, we spent the morning hauling out everything old rugs that had gathered mildew. Mismatched flower pots, rusted tools, a pair of forgotten wind chimes. She didn't say much, but her movements were purposeful, almost cleansing. Each item she set aside seemed to carry a small weight. Like part of the story she'd told herself for too long was being lifted. At one point, she pulled out a small wooden crate filled with art supplies pastels. Charcoals, acrylics, some still sealed. She sat down on the ground and held one of the paint tubes up to the light, turning it slowly in her hand. I bought these thinking I'd need them the moment I was free, she said. But I didn't realize how much harder it was to want something after you've convinced yourself you don't deserve it. That line stayed with me. We cleared the shed in. Silence after that, except for the occasional comment about where to put things or whether something was worth saving. By early afternoon, the space was empty, but filled with possibility. The dust had been swept, the shelves wiped down, the air circulated. She stood in the doorway looking in like she didn't quite believe it was real. I asked her what she wanted. To do with it now? And she shrugged. Maybe nothing, she said. Or maybe everything. I think it just feels good to have it open again. Later, while she made tea inside, I found myself walking around the yard, noticing the details I'd overlooked before. The way the ivy curled up the sides of the fence. The way the stepping stones sank slightly into the earth as if the ground had been holding them for her. It was a quiet kind of place, not showy or manicured, but real, like her. I wandered back to the kitchen, where she handed me a mug and motioned for us to sit on the floor near the window. The sun patching across the tiles in lazy gold stripes. We sat in companionable silence for a while, both of us sipping slowly, letting the day settle into our bones. Then she told me something unexpected. You know, when I said I hadn't felt this young in 15 years, it wasn't just about the painting. She stared into her tea for a second, as if stirring the words together. It was about waking up with something to look forward to, about not bracing myself for disappointment. I forgot how light that makes you feel. I didn't say anything at first. I just let the silence hold space for her words. Then I told her I was honored to be a part of this version of her that was unfolding slowly, like a flower unsure of spring but choosing to bloom anyway. She looked at me then, really looked, and for a brief second, there was something in her gaze that felt like an invitation. But she didn't reach for more. She didn't need to. We weren't rushing toward anything, just letting it happen hour by hour, day by day. We spent the rest of the afternoon sorting through the last few boxes she had stacked in the hallway. One of them was filled with old letters and postcards, some from friends, some from her daughter, a few from her ex-husband during the early years of their relationship. She read a few out loud, laughing gently at the naivete of the words, the youthful urgency of promises that were never meant to last forever. I don't regret it, she said. Even the worst of it shaped me. But I do wish I hadn't waited so long to forgive myself. There was something unshakable about the way she said it. Not sad, not dramatic, just true, like a thread, finally being tied off after years of unraveling. As the light began to fade and the golden hour painted everything with a gentle fire, Nadine reached into one of the smaller boxes and pulled out a photo I hadn't seen before. It was her, maybe in her early 20s, standing beside an old easel with a painting half-finished behind her. She was laughing in the picture, eyes closed, arms thrown up like she was dancing. That's the last time I painted in public. She said a local art fair. I was terrified. I studied the image and saw in it a version of her that still existed, not gone, just tucked away, waiting. She placed the photo on the windowsill and looked out across the yard. I think I'm ready to find her again, she said softly. Not copy her, not go back, just find her in the way I speak, in the way I move through the world, in the way I choose things that make me feel alive. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just a woman rediscovering herself. This was someone rewriting the rules of what aging meant, what womanhood could look like, what it meant to start over without apology. She wasn't looking for someone to rescue her. She was learning to stand on her own again, but with company. This time someone who could see her clearly, without trying to reshape her. As I packed up my tools and prepared to leave, she handed me a list again. This time, it wasn't a to-do list. It was a what next list. At the top was the word possibilities. The 10th day started with rain, soft and unhurried, the kind that makes everything quieter and more thoughtful. I sat in my truck. For a few moments after arriving at Nadine's house, watching droplets chase each other down the windshield, letting the stillness settle over me. The house looked different now, not in any dramatic way, but in the way something familiar begins to feel new when you've grown close to it. There was a warmth to it, a lived-in energy that hadn't been there before. Curtains that once hung stiffly now swayed with the breeze, and the porch, once empty, now held a potted plant or two. A folded throw blanket over the rocking chair and a pair of garden clogs by the door. It was as if Nadine's spirit had begun, expanding outward, reclaiming not just the rooms inside but the space around them. She met me at the door without her usual greeting, no apron or checklist or coffee cup. Instead, she opened the door and simply said, "I was hoping you'd come even with the rain." There was a softness in her voice, a kind of vulnerability that carried no fear, just honesty. I stepped inside, shaking off my jacket, and she led me to the kitchen where the morning light filtered through the window in streaks between raindrops. The table was set with 2 mugs, a plate of still-warm muffins, and a newspaper folded open to the crossword. "I didn't plan anything for us to fix today," she said as we sat down. "Just wanted to talk," and so we did. At first, the conversation drifted like the rain, gentle, aimless, touching old stories and half-finished thoughts. She told me about her daughter again, more this time than before, about how she'd once wanted to be a musician but had ended up managing a retail store, how proud Nadine was of her resilience, even if they didn't always see eye to eye. She talked about a road trip they took years ago, just the 2 of them. When her daughter was a teenager, and Nadine still believed she could fix everything with the right amount of effort and love, I was wrong, she admitted. But I learned that love isn't about fixing. It's about staying, even when things crack a little. We talked about aging, about how no one really prepares you for the way time sneaks up, not just in wrinkles or aches, but in the shifting of priorities. The quiet fading of friendships, the small betrayals of memory. People think growing older is about becoming wise, she said with a laugh, but really it's about learning what to let go of and what to hold tighter than ever. I told her that made sense, that maybe the real wisdom wasn't in knowing everything, but in knowing what matters enough to keep close. At one point, she grew quiet, tracing the rim of her mug with her finger. Then, almost out of nowhere, she asked, "Do you ever feel like you're still waiting for your life to begin?" The question caught me off guard, not because I hadn't thought it myself, but because I hadn't expected her to voice something so raw. I nodded slowly and told her yes, that sometimes I felt like I was still preparing for a future I couldn't quite picture, like standing at a train station waiting for the next step to arrive. She smiled sadly and said, "Me too, and I'm 53. Isn't that something?" We sat with that truth for a while, no need to sugarcoat it, no desire to rush past it. Just the quiet understanding that even as life moves forward, the sense of becoming never really stops. Eventually, she reached into the drawer beside her and pulled out a small notebook. The cover was worn, the pages frayed at the edges. "This," she said, "is my someday book." She flipped it open and showed me pages filled with lists things she'd once wanted to do, places to visit, fears to overcome. Some were crossed out. Most weren't. "I stopped adding to it years ago," she said. "But lately I've been thinking, it's time to start again." She handed it to me and asked if I wanted to write something in it. A goal, a dream, a thought, anything. I hesitated at first. It felt too personal, too intimate, but then I realized that was the point. To be seen, to share space in someone else's hope. I took the pen and wrote one simple line, "Learn how to stay." She read it, didn't comment, just nodded and closed the book, placing it gently on the table like something precious. After that, the day unfolded in slow motion. We didn't do much, sorted a few things in the hall closet, watched the rain. From the front window, listened to a record she hadn't played in years. At one point, she danced a little, swaying barefoot in the kitchen while the music played. She caught me watching and laughed, cheeks flushed, and said, "I feel ridiculous." I told her she looked free. She stopped for a moment, smiled again, and whispered, "I haven't felt this young in 15 years. There it was, the line. But this time, it wasn't just a sentence. It was a declaration, not of age, but of spirit. A reminder that youth isn't just about the number of years behind you, it's about choosing joy again, even when the world tells you it's too late. It's about risking embarrassment for the sake of feeling alive. Nadine wasn't trying to turn back time. She was simply meeting herself again. It's after all the years of waiting. As the evening came and the rain slowed to a drizzle, I prepared to leave. She walked me to the door, the air between us filled with a gentle kind of closeness. Not romantic, not defined, just real. She placed a hand on my arm and said, "Thank you for showing up, not just to paint, but to witness." A gift I didn't know I needed. I told her I'd be back the next day, but not for work. I wanted to help her build something in the shed, a table, a shelf, maybe even a small desk for her art. She lit up at the suggestion and said she'd make sandwiches. As I stepped off the porch, I looked back to see her standing there, arms folded loosely, framed by the soft light of her home. And I realized that this story we were living didn't need a dramatic climax or a clear resolution. It was enough that it was happening, that it was honest, that it was hers. She wasn't a project. She wasn't someone broken to be fixed. She was a person in motion, healing, trying, beginning again, and I was simply lucky to walk beside her. For a little while, the next morning, the skies had cleared, as the world outside seemed washed clean, as if the storm the day before had reset something not just in the air, but in the rhythm of everything. I arrived at Nadine's just as the early light cast golden streaks across the dewy grass. And for a few seconds I sat in the truck and just watched the house. There was something grounding about the way the morning settled around it, quiet. Simple, steady. I could see movement through the kitchen window, the silhouette of Nadine fussing with something on the counter. And even from that distance I could tell she was humming again. Not loud enough for the world to hear, but just enough to remind herself she was still here, still waking up to more than just routine. When I knocked on the door, she opened it, wearing an old flannel shirt over a tank top, her sleeves rolled up, her hair loosely tied back. She looked rested, lighter, like she had slept through something that had been chasing her for years. She greeted me with a smile and a sandwich wrapped in parchment paper, which she handed over without a word, motioning for me to follow her around the side of the house, toward the shed. There was no small talk this time, no preamble. She just moved like someone who had made up her mind. Inside the shed, the dust we'd cleared days ago hadn't returned. The air felt settled, like the space had been waiting to be used. I set down my tools, and she handed me a sketch on wrinkled paper. It was a rough drawing of a small table with storage underneath, designed to hold her paints and supplies, with a wide surface for sketching or journaling. "I drew this last night," she said, "but feel free to change whatever doesn't make sense. I'm not a builder." Told her I thought it was perfect as is. A simple, sturdy workspace built not just for function, but for hope. We began measuring and marking the way people do when building something that matters. She helped hold the board steady as I cut, her fingers brushing mine more than once, neither of us pulling away. There was no electricity in the shed, so we worked by daylight, our tools echoing softly in the small space. Between the hammering and the sawdust, there was a rhythm that developed a shared silence, punctuated by glances and half-smiles, by Nadine brushing hair out of her eyes with the back of her wrist, or me muttering measurements under my breath. At one point, while I was securing one of the table legs, she sat on a small stool nearby and asked, "Do you ever wonder if maybe we were meant to meet certain people, not to change our lives, but to remind us we're allowed to change them ourselves?" I paused before answering. She didn't look at me when she said it, just stared at the plank of wood in front of her, tracing the grain with her thumb. I told her I thought that was exactly it, that maybe people show up not to be the answer, but to be the mirror, to reflect the parts we forgot how to see. She smiled faintly and said, "I'm glad you came." The table came together slower than I'd expected, but it didn't matter. Every piece we fit, every screw we tightened, felt like another stitch in a story. We weren't rushing to finish. She stained the wood while I cleaned up the edges, and as the hours passed, the shed began to transform, not just physically, but in essence. What had been a forgotten structure now felt like a sanctuary. The walls didn't just hold up the roof. They held space for something beginning. Later, we sat on the steps of the shed with glasses of iced tea, the sun dropping low behind the trees. The table stood inside, complete and solid, ready to be used. Nadine rested her head against the doorframe and let out a long breath. "I didn't know I needed this," she said. "Not just the table, but the act of making it, of deciding I wanted something again." I told her it wasn't too late to want more, that wanting didn't expire with youth or seasons or circumstance, it evolved. Sometimes it took longer to resurface, but that didn't make it less worthy. She looked at me then, really looked, and in her eyes was a question she didn't say out loud. I didn't answer it either, not with words. But I held her gaze, and for a few long seconds, we sat in the middle of something fragile and beautiful, an understanding that didn't need definition. We weren't a couple. We weren't strangers. We were two people who had stepped into each other's lives at just the right time, carrying quiet grief and quiet hope, and found room enough to heal beside each other. That evening, she showed me a painting she'd started in secret. She'd tucked it behind a curtain in the back room and hadn't told anyone about it. It wasn't finished rough edges, blurred lines, colors that hadn't quite found their place, but it was striking. A woman standing on a shoreline at dusk, her face turned toward the sea, her expression unreadable but full of possibility. "It's not me," she said quickly, almost defensively. "It's just someone who's learning how to stand still without giving up." I told her it looked like someone who had chosen to return to herself. She didn't correct me. Before I left, she handed me a folded note. "Don't read it until you get home," she said with a smirk. I promised I wouldn't. The drive back felt different, that day like something had shifted between morning and night that couldn't be undone. It's not a change in relationship, but a deepening of presence. I didn't know what the note would say, and I didn't need to. What mattered was that she'd written it. When I got home, I sat on the edge of my bed, folded the paper, and read her handwriting, small, neat, unmistakably hers. It said, "Thank you for reminding me that I'm allowed to keep growing." Didn't fix me. You just stood beside me while I remembered how to pick up the brush again. That's a kind of love too, even if no one else sees it that way. I held the paper for a long time. There was nothing else on the page. No signature, no date, just that message, as honest and unembellished as the woman who wrote it. I folded it back up and placed it in my drawer, not because I needed to keep it, but because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be part of someone's beginning. The 12th day felt like something in the middle, no longer the beginning, but not quite near an end. That kind of liminal space where every small gesture begins to feel layered with meaning, and every silence holds the weight of everything left unsaid. I arrived a little earlier than usual, the sky still stretching itself awake, a dull golden blush casting shadows along Nadine's front steps. There was a new potted fern beside the door, something green and lively. And I noticed the wreath she'd hung on the front had been dusted and realigned. Small things, quiet shifts, like the house itself was paying attention to the change in. Its owner, when she opened the door, she didn't smile immediately. Her expression was contemplative, like she'd been thinking deeply and hadn't quite come back up to the surface yet. But then she stepped aside to let me in, and her hand lingered lightly on my shoulder as I passed. It was the kind of contact that didn't demand anything, didn't ask for a response, just was. We went into the kitchen where she had already brewed coffee, and for a few minutes we sipped in silence. The hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards, the only sounds filling the space. She finally broke the silence by saying she had gone out the night before. Not far, just to the corner bookstore, and then a quiet cafe. She had taken one of the books I'd left in the Shadane old novel about second chances, and brought it with her. Wanted to see how it felt, she said, to sit alone somewhere. That wasn't my own house, and not feel like everyone was watching me. I asked her how it felt. She smiled, strange at first, but good, free. She took another sip of her coffee and added, "I didn't wear makeup, didn't even brush my hair properly. I just went as I was. Nobody cared. That made me feel young again. Not because I looked young, but because I didn't need permission to show up." That line stayed with me the rest of the day. After breakfast, we went out to the shed. She had brought down some of her supplies and spread them across the new table sketchbooks. Paints, a set of old brushes she had soaked and cleaned. She asked if I wanted to stay while she painted or if I'd rather come back later. I'd stay as long as she didn't mind quiet company. She didn't. In fact, I think she needed it. So I found a chair in the corner, cracked open a paperback I'd brought, and let the minutes pass like water. Occasionally I glanced up and saw her lost in motion, her brush sweeping over canvas, her brow furrowed, lips pressed in concentration. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with presence. She was inside herself in those moments, unapologetically creating. It was like watching someone breathe after holding it in for too long. At one point, she paused and asked me if I'd ever thought about doing something completely different with my life. "Not just quitting a job," she said, "but quitting a version of yourself that you no longer recognize." I told her I thought about it all the time. That some days, being a handyman felt like both a gift and a sentence liberating in its simplicity, confining in its repetition. She nodded like she understood and said, "I think I built my whole identity around being needed. And when no one needed me anymore, I forgot how to just be." She showed me the painting she was working on then. It was abstract swirls of color, light and shadow weaving together like weather systems or old memories. "It's not done," she said, "but it's what yesterday felt like." I stared at it for a long time, letting the emotion of it settle into me. It wasn't about what it looked like. It was about what it said, that even the messy, unresolved parts of us could still be worth putting on canvas. We spent the rest of the afternoon rearranging the shed. She wanted to hang some lights from the beams, string them across like little constellations. She brought out an old speaker and played soft music that reminded her of the early 2000s singer-songwriters with rasped voices and lyrics about beginnings. I installed a few wall hooks for her brushes and tools, added a pegboard to hold her palettes. It was becoming a space she could grow into, not just visit. Around late afternoon, as we stood in the doorway looking over what we'd built, she said something that caught me off guard. "Do you ever wonder what people think when they see us?" I glanced at her, unsure how to respond at first. She continued, "A woman in her 50s and a man who's, late 30s? I nodded. 37, I said. She shrugged. "It's funny how age seems like everything when you're young. Ow. But now, I just don't want to miss out on people because I'm afraid of what someone else might think." I told her I didn't care what people thought, that I hadn't really thought much about it, to be honest. What mattered was how I felt when I was around her, and being around her made me more myself. That seemed to matter more than anything else. She didn't say anything in return, just reached for my hand and held it for a moment. Then she let go. We went back inside and cooked dinner together. Nothing fancy, just grilled vegetables and a little pasta. But it felt intimate, like the kind of meal shared between people who had learned each other's rhythms. She moved around the kitchen with more ease now, less self-conscious, more playful. She bumped my hip with hers at one point and laughed, and the sound of it filled the room like light. Realized then how much she had changed, not just on the surface, but in the way she moved through the space. She was no longer hiding. We ate by candlelight, not for romance, but because the sun had set and neither of us wanted to turn on the overhead light. The dim glow gave the evening a softness, a way to end the day without interruption. After dinner, we washed the dishes together, hands brushing in the warm water, a rhythm forming without words. And when it was time to leave, I lingered at the door, not quite ready to step out of that moment. She surprised me then by walking me to my truck. The air was cool, the sky scattered with stars just beginning to peek through the darkness. She looked up and said, "I used to think it was too late for all this." I asked her for what. She looked at me, her eyes soft and steady. "Beginning again." And in that moment, I knew it wasn't. The days that followed seemed to fold gently into one another, less like chapters and more like verses in a song that didn't mind repeating its favorite lines. There was no set schedule anymore. No formal agreement of what we were working on, no expectation of what came next. I would arrive mid-morning, sometimes with a box of pastries, sometimes with a few tools just in case something needed fixing. But mostly I came because it felt natural now. Nadine didn't wait for me with a checklist anymore. She waited with 2 mugs of coffee and a different story from her past ready to spill out. Or sometimes with quiet music playing in the shed and a brush already in her hand, her gaze caught. Between the strokes she made and the memories they awakened, that particular morning, the sun was already high. When I pulled into the driveway, she greeted me barefoot, standing on the porch with paint streaks on her arms, and a kind of light in her face I hadn't seen before. Not joy exactly, but freedom. That subtle, powerful shift when someone starts living on their own terms. She waved me in and told me she wanted to show me something in the shed before we did anything else. So I followed her, and when she opened the door, I paused in the frame, a little taken aback. The entire space had been rearranged again. Her painting table was now against the back wall, surrounded by pinned sketches and little sticky notes with half-finished ideas. The corner where I usually sat now had a second stool and a small easel. On it sat a blank canvas. She turned to me and said, "I want you to paint with me today." I laughed at first, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't smiling. It's not in the way that meant she was teasing. She was serious. She handed me a brush and said, "It doesn't matter what you paint. It doesn't even have to make sense. I just want you to try." For me, and I think that was what made me do it. Not the request itself, but the way she phrased it. Brr. There was something about her asking that made me feel like this was more than just a shared hobby. This was trust. This was her letting me into a part of herself she used to keep hidden, even from herself. So I sat down beside her. She gave me a palette and a few colors and told me to start with what I felt, not what I thought. At first, it felt ridiculous. I didn't know what I was doing, and the canvas stayed mostly blank while she worked beside me with graceful familiarity. But slowly, something in me softened. I let go of the idea of making something beautiful and instead started making something honest. I smeared colors that reminded me of the morning light on her porch, of the deep gray of her hair when it caught the shadows just right, of the soft rust red of her kitchen walls. Shapes came out clumsy, lines wobbled, but I kept going. And beside me, Nadine didn't correct me, didn't comment, didn't even glance over. She just kept painting, her own world unfolding in sync with mine. After an hour or so, we stepped back to look at our work. Mine was a mess, abstract and chaotic, but it held something I couldn't explain. Hers was quieter, a single tree standing in the middle of a wind-blown field, bending just slightly to the right. "That's me," she said, pointing to the tree still standing. Even now, I didn't say anything. I just looked at her and nodded, because there was nothing I could add that would be more true than that image. We cleaned our brushes in silence. And then, as we stepped out into the yard, she said she wanted to go somewhere, not far. It's just a place she hadn't visited in years. There was a nature trail just outside of town, one she used to walk with her daughter when she was little. "I want to see if it still remembers me," she said, half smiling. So we climbed into my truck, the windows down, the air thick with summer's edge, and we drove. The trailhead was quiet when we arrived, overgrown in places but still walkable. She hesitated just a moment before stepping onto the path, like she wasn't sure the ground would still welcome her. But then she moved forward, and I followed. The walk was slow, not because of age, but because of reverence. Familiar to her, every turn a memory. She pointed out the stone where her daughter once fell and scraped her knee, the hollow log they used to sit on and share juice boxes. Her voice wavered sometimes, not with sadness, but with the ache of time. "It feels like another life," she whispered at one point. But I was still me back then, just more afraid. Halfway through the trail, we came to a clearing where the trees opened up and let the sunlight pour in. There was a bench there, worn down by years of weather, and we sat for a long time without talking. It wasn't until the wind picked up that she finally turned to me and said, "Do you know what's strange? I thought this part of my life would be about endings, about quiet and retreat, but it's not. It's about permission. I've been waiting for someone to tell me it was okay to still feel alive, and it turns out I just had to tell myself." I looked at her then, at the way the light caught the lines in her face, the softness in her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes, and I realized she wasn't a woman rediscovering youth. She was a woman rewriting the story of what it meant to age on her own terms, her own time, and without asking for permission anymore. We sat there until the light began to shift, until the breeze cooled just enough to remind us that the day was passing. On the way back through the trail, she reached for my hand, not for balance or support, just because she wanted to, and I held it without hesitation. That night, as I dropped her off and turned to leave, she stopped me with a question that hung in the air like mist. "Do you think people can fall in love after they've already learned how to live alone?" I didn't answer right away. I looked at her, standing there on her porch, bathed in the porch light and all the complexity she carried. And then I said, "I think the best kind of love begins when you stop needing it, when it becomes a choice, not a rescue." She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving mine, and said, "Then maybe I'm finally ready to choose." The following day came with a softness in the air, the kind that makes even the most ordinary moments feel laced with something sacred. I woke up thinking about Nadine, not just about her smile or the way she had held my hand during that walk in the woods, but about the question she had asked the night before, the one that still echoed in my head like a half-remembered melody. "Do you think people can fall in love after they've already learned how to live alone?" That question didn't haunt me. It invited me. It asked me to look closer, to peel back the layers of what we had been building between us and see if maybe Just maybe, it was more than friendship, more than understanding, more than quiet company. Maybe it was love in its most mature, form-slow, burning, patient, and deeply rooted. When I pulled up to her house, she was already outside watering the small garden she'd started along the fence. The woman who had once hidden behind her screen. Dora was now standing barefoot in the dirt, sun on her shoulders, humming softly. She didn't turn around when she heard my truck, didn't rush to greet me. She just finished what she was doing, gave the soil one last drink, then stood up and brushed her hands on her jeans. When she looked at me, she smiled not with surprise, but with recognition. Like I had simply arrived in a chapter she had already begun writing in her mind. We didn't say much that morning. We didn't need to. It was something unspoken. Between us now, a shared awareness that everything had shifted slightly, like a boat turning quietly with the tide. She invited me in, handed me a cup of tea this time instead of coffee, and led me to the back porch where a breeze moved gently through the trees. We sat in rocking chairs, the creak of wood and wind our only soundtrack for a while. Then, almost as an afterthought, she said she wanted to show me something new she'd been working on. We went into the shed, which had transformed again. She had moved the painting table closer to the window to catch more light and pinned on. The walls were a series of small canvases, each no bigger than a notebook. On each one, she had painted moments vignettes of her life. One showed the porch swing from her childhood home. Another, the silhouette of a woman standing in a kitchen at dawn. And another was unmistakably me, even if abstract. The back of a man in a flannel shirt bent over a workbench, with sunlight pouring in behind him. I didn't realize I was painting you, she said, until I stepped back and saw it. I didn't know what to say to that, so I stepped closer to look. Her brushstrokes were deliberate, her colors rich with emotion. These weren't just paintings. They were memories, rendered in oil and pigment. They were the parts of her life she'd finally allowed herself to revisit. And I was in them, not as a guest. It's a part of the story. She pointed to the empty canvas on the floor near her stool and said, I haven't figured out what this one will be yet, but it feels like it's waiting for something. I asked if maybe it was waiting for us. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. Later, as we made lunch together, grilled cheese and tomato soup, simple and warm, she brought out an old photo album. We sat at the table flipping through pages filled with her younger self, her daughter at various ages, her late husband, friends who had come and gone. Each image sparked a story, and I listened with care, because I knew these weren't just stories. They were pieces of a life she had fought hard to reclaim. There was a photo of her in her 30s, standing beside a camper van on a road trip she said had changed her entire worldview. I used to think adventure had to look like that, she said. But now I realize the bravest thing I've done lately is invite someone into my home without pretending I have it all together. That line sat with me the rest of the afternoon. It wasn't the big trips, the loud milestones, or the dramatic declarations that marked the turning points in our lives. Sometimes, it was simply the courage to open the door without apology. To let someone see you in your truest form and trust that they wouldn't flinch. As the sun dipped low and stretched shadows across the kitchen floor, she turned to me and said, Do you want to go somewhere with me tonight? I nodded without asking where. I would have followed her anywhere by then. We got in my truck and drove out toward the edge of town. Past the diner, the old railroad station, and onto a dirt road that led to a quiet overlook. It wasn't marked on maps. You wouldn't find it unless you were looking for nothing in particular. But when we got there, the sky had opened up into a full watercolor canvas, pinks, purples, and burnt oranges melting into one another. She stepped out, wrapped herself in a shawl, and leaned on the hood of the truck. I joined her, and for a long while, we just stood there watching the world exhale. Then she said, almost like an afterthought, I used to come here with my daughter. We'd eat snacks and make up stories about the clouds. I haven't been back since she moved away. I glanced at her, but she wasn't crying. She was remembering. That felt more powerful. She looked at me again, and her eyes held a different kind of question this time. Not about timing, not about age, but about courage. And without breaking eye contact, she said, You know, I meant what I said before. I haven't felt this young in 15 years. I nodded. I believe you. Then she did something that neither of us had done until now. She reached up and gently placed her hand on my face, not to pull me closer, not to kiss me, but to feel the truth of the moment, to mark it. I leaned into the touch and placed my hand over hers. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a handyman fixing someone else's broken parts. I felt like a man who had been given the rare chance to witness someone rebuilding herself from the inside out. As we stood there in the dusk, wind threading around us, she whispered something so quiet I almost didn't catch it. "I think I'm falling for the version of me you see." And in that moment I knew I already had. The days that followed felt different. Not just because of the way Nadine and I had stood under that painted sky. Not just because of what she said, but because something unspoken between us had finally taken root. We didn't label anything, didn't suddenly change our routines. But everything felt heavier with meaning now, more tender in its pacing. It was as if the silence between our words was doing more talking than we ever could. She still made coffee in the mornings and waited for me barefoot by the garden. I still showed up with tools I may or may not need, finding small things around the house to fix. But now, there was an ease between us, softness in the way we moved around one another. It's like we'd finally settled into a rhythm neither of us wanted to disturb. That morning, I noticed something on her face, an absent smile, barely there. The kind that people wear when they're not even aware they're happy. She'd started humming more, not songs I recognized, just little melodies that drifted out as she moved through the kitchen. I asked if she had slept well, and she said better than she had in months. Then she asked if I'd mind helping her clean out the attic later that day. She said she hadn't been up there in years and figured it was time to let go of things she no longer needed. So after our coffee and a walk around the garden, we grabbed flashlights and climbed the narrow wooden stairs to the attic. It was the kind of space that carried decades in its dust boxes labeled with faded ink. Stacks of old photo albums, and even her daughter's childhood art projects. The air was thick with forgotten stories. And as we started sifting through the piles, Nadine would pause every few minutes to hold something in her hands, a letter, a scarf, a framed photo, and then quietly decide whether to keep or let go. She wasn't crying. She wasn't sentimental in the way some people get when sorting through memories. Instead, she was measured, respectful of what the past had given her, but more focused on what the future could still hold. She told me about her late husband as she held a framed photo of the two of them from the early 90s. They had gone to a jazz festival on a whim, got sunburned, and danced barefoot in a parking lot. She laughed, remembering it, then carefully set the photo aside. "I loved him," she said, "not to me, but into the room." But that chapter closed a long time ago. I nodded. Didn't need more than that. We spent the next few hours clearing space, making piles, lifting boxes down. The ladder. At one point, she pulled out a dusty old record player, one she didn't even remember still owning. We brought it down to the living room, cleaned it up, and tried plugging it in. The thing actually worked. She found a few records: Zella Fitzgerald, Carole King, a scratched copy of Fleetwood Mac, and soon the house was filled with warm, crackling music. She kicked off her shoes, poured us each a glass of iced tea, and pulled me into the living room. "Dance with me," she said. And I did, slowly, tentatively. Not because I was nervous, but because I knew this was a moment she'd remember. I didn't want to rush it. We didn't speak while we danced, just moved in circles, as the afternoon light filtered through the blinds. Her head rested against my shoulder, and I could feel her heartbeat, not frantic, not uncertain, just present. There was something ancient and honest about it. It's like we weren't just two people in their 30s and 50s dancing in a living room. We were two souls who had finally exhaled. After the song faded, we sat on the couch and listened to the next track. She turned to me, brushed a bit of dust from my collar, and said something simple but profound. "You make me feel like I don't have to apologize for who I am anymore." I didn't respond right away. I let the weight of her words settle between us. Then I told her that being with her didn't feel like I was helping someone. It felt like I was finally being met, seen, held in a space that asked for nothing but my presence. She nodded, then leaned her head on my shoulder. and we sat there until the sun began to dip. Later that evening, after I helped her finish boxing up the last of the attic clutter, we brought the donations out to her garage. She paused before locking the door and said, "You know, I used to think this kind of closeness would terrify me, that I'd build walls so high no one would ever get through again." Then she looked at me and added, "But you didn't knock. Those walls down, you waited outside them. Eventually, I opened the door." I told her I hadn't done it on purpose. I was just showing up. She smiled and said that sometimes showing up is the bravest thing a person can do. We stood in the driveway for a few minutes longer, under the purple-orange sky, and she reached for my hand again, not to make a statement, not to prove a point, but simply because she wanted to. Before I left that night, she handed me a small envelope. "Don't open it until you get home," she said. I nodded, curious but respectful. When I got back to my place, I sat on the edge of my bed, tore it open carefully, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a handwritten note. It said, "I don't know where this is going, and I'm not asking for promises. But I want you to know that you've helped me remember parts of myself I thought were gone forever. That alone means more than I can say. Thank you for the kindness, the patience, the laughter, the silence, the paint on the walls, and the space to begin again. I'm not the same woman you met on day one, and I like who I'm becoming." At the bottom, she had drawn a tiny, clumsy heart. No flourish, no pretense, just a mark of something real. And sitting there, holding that note, I realized something too. I wasn't the same man I'd been either. The next morning arrived draped in a silver mist that clung to the fields and blurred the sharp edges of the world. I sat on my porch with a mug of coffee, staring out at the hazy quiet, Nadine's note still resting on the table beside me. I had read it 3 times since I woke up. Once out of curiosity, once out of disbelief, and once just to feel close. To the words again, they weren't dramatic or overly romantic, but they had weight, the kind of weight that settles into your chest and stays there long after the words are gone. She had seen me, really seen me, and more than that, she'd allowed herself to be seen in return. I hadn't realized how much I'd been craving something like that until it was in front of me. When I finally pulled into her driveway, she was already outside, trimming the bushes that lined her walkway. She looked up with that same subtle smile that had begun to replace the guarded expression she used to wear like armor. I walked up and asked if she needed help, and she just handed me the hedge clippers without a word. We worked in tandem, no small talk necessary, the rhythm of the clippers and the chirping of morning birds filling the space between us. At one point, she paused and said over her shoulder, "You read the letter?" I said I did. Follow-up didn't ask what I thought or how I felt. She just nodded once and went back to trimming. It wasn't until we were back inside, making breakfast, that she brought it up again. She was cutting strawberries and I was frying eggs when she said, "I wasn't sure if I should give that to you." I kept rewriting it in my head, trying to make it sound less vulnerable. I looked at her and said, "It didn't need rewriting. It was perfect the way it was." She looked down at the fruit for a second, then said quietly, "Thank you." After breakfast, we didn't have any tasks lined up. The kitchen was nearly finished. The yard looked better than it had in years, and the attic was clear. For the first time in weeks, we had nothing urgent to do on yet. Neither of us seemed eager to part ways. Nadine suggested we take a drive. "Just somewhere we haven't been," she said. "No agenda." Agreed. And we ended up taking the scenic route out of town, winding through back roads that twisted between hills and valleys like veins through an old hand. Eventually, we stumbled upon a roadside antique shop, a place that looked like it hadn't seen customers in days, maybe weeks. Nadine's eyes lit up at the sight of it. Inside, the place was packed with everything from rusted farm tools to mismatched tea sets, dusty books, faded postcards, and old furniture that creaked under its own age. Nadine wandered through the aisles like she was in a museum of someone else's memories. At one point, she stopped at a wooden jewelry box with faded roses carved into the lid. She opened it slowly, revealing a velvet interior lined with dust and time. I had one just like this, she said, more to herself than to me. It played music when you opened it. She didn't buy it. She just closed it gently and moved on. But I noticed the way her fingers lingered on the wood. We left the shop, without buying anything, but with a shared feeling that we'd uncovered something important, not in the objects, but in each other. On the way back, she asked if I ever thought about what kind of legacy I'd leave behind. I said I wasn't sure. I used to think it had to be something big, she said. Something lasting like a book, or a foundation, or a family that spoke your name in reverence. But now, I think maybe it's simpler. Maybe it's just about the way you make someone feel when they're around you. I turned to her and said, "You make me feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She didn't reply right away, but I saw her eyes shimmer just slightly in the sunlight as we drove on in silence. When we returned to her house, it felt even more like home than it had before. She invited me to stay for dinner and we cooked. Together without a recipe, just grabbed what was in the fridge and made it work. We ended up with something oddly delicious, lemon chicken with roasted vegetables and a haphazard salad that somehow felt gourmet because we made it side by side. Afterward, we sat on the floor of the living room, leaning against the couch, full and content. The record player spun a slow jazz tune in the corner. Nadine rested her head on my shoulder and said, "You know, I used to think falling in love meant fireworks and wild declarations. Not now. I think it might just be this exact moment." I turned and looked at her, at the lines in her face softened by candlelight, and said, "If this is what falling in love feels like, then I never want to hit the ground." She laughed softly, then whispered, "Stay the night." There was no tension in the question, no pressure. Just a quiet invitation, like someone asking you to stay a little longer at the end of a good story. I said yes. That night we didn't rush anything. We didn't cross any lines too fast or try to define what this meant. We simply existed in the same space, close enough to feel each other's warmth, far enough to let time do its own work. She brought out extra blankets. I made tea, and we sat on the couch watching an old movie neither of us really paid attention to. At some point, she fell asleep with her head in my lap, her breathing slow and steady, and I didn't dare move. I just watched her, the rise and fall of her chest, the way her fingers curled loosely against her stomach, and I thought to myself, this is it. This is what I've been waiting for and didn't even know I needed. Not a whirlwind, not a rescue, just this trust, peace, presence. That was the night I realized love wasn't something you chased. It was something you allowed. Something you welcomed, like an old friend who shows up unexpectedly and says, "I've been here all along. You just needed to be ready." Morning sunlight poured through the blinds in soft slats across the hardwood floor, the kind of light that makes everything look warmer, gentler. I opened my eyes to the sound of birdsong outside her window, a far cry from the usual hum of my apartment building's old pipes and distant traffic. Nadine was still asleep, curled up beneath the knitted blanket she kept on the couch. I didn't move, just watched her for a moment. How peaceful she looked, how quiet her breath was, the hint of a smile that lingered like she was dreaming of something worth staying in. There was no urgency, no noise, just stillness. Just the comfort of knowing that whatever this was between us, it didn't need to be named to be felt. Eventually, she stirred and stretched with the grace of someone who had finally rested well. She blinked at me and smiled, that soft, unguarded kind of smile you can't fake. "Morning," she whispered, voice still husky with sleep. I returned the greeting just as quietly, not wanting to break the atmosphere that had cocooned itself around us overnight. We made breakfast together again, this time working in a rhythm that felt rehearsed even though it wasn't. She chopped herbs, whisked eggs, and we moved around each other like we'd done it 100 times. When we sat down to eat, she looked out the window and said, "I used to eat every meal alone in this house, even when I wasn't technically alone." That sentence hung in the air, weighty in its simplicity. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need to. I just reached out and let my hand rest gently over hers. She turned her palm up and intertwined her fingers with mine. And for a while, we just sat like that, letting the silence be what it was. Neist, comforting, necessary. Later that day, she invited me to help her with a small community project. She'd recently signed up for a mural painting at the local library. "I haven't done anything like this in years," she admitted as we drove there, "but I figured it was time to be around people again, to use my hands for something." Other than cleaning out closets, I could tell she was nervous, even if she didn't say it directly. But I also saw the spark in her eyes, that flicker of the old Nadine I had only seen glimpses of, until now, the one who used to road trip, who once painted her entire dining room coral. Just because she liked the name on the paint swatch, the library was already buzzing with volunteers when we arrived. Kids holding brushes too big for their hands. Teens trying to look cool while painting cartoon owls. Older folks taking their time with delicate lines and patterns. Nadine lit up as soon as she stepped into the crowd, a little unsure at first. But slowly opening like a flower in sunlight, she joined a group of women painting a large tree on the side wall. Her movements tentative at first, then more confident as her brush began to move with purpose. I stood back for a while, watching her reclaim something she'd forgotten she loved, being part of something bigger than herself. Surrounded by others, contributing, laughing, I took over a section of sky on the opposite side and lost myself in the rhythm of it. There was something grounding about putting paint on a wall with no other goal than to make something beautiful. A little girl came up to me, probably 8 or 9, and asked if she could help. I handed her my brush, showed her how to blend the colors, and we worked together in a quiet camaraderie that needed no words. Across the wall, I saw Nadine glance over, her expression warm and full of something I couldn't quite name yet. When we were finished, the wall was transformed, vibrant, joyful, full of color and life. Everyone stood back to admire the work, and someone took a group photo. Nadine stood beside me, our shoulders touching, and whispered, "I forgot how much I missed being out in the world." I turned to her and said, "It missed you too." She looked at me with something deep in her eyes, something that said she wasn't just thankful I had helped her rediscover something essential. That evening, we stopped at a roadside diner on the way home. Nothing fancy, red vinyl booths, a jukebox playing faded hits, the smell of fried food clinging to the air, but it felt right. We shared a milkshake, the old-fashioned way, each with a straw from opposite sides of the glass. She teased me about my sweet tooth. I teased her about her inability to finish a whole burger. And we both laughed so easily it felt like we had been doing it for years. Somewhere between dessert and the check, she reached across the table and said, "You've been good for me." I took her hand in mine and replied, "You've been real for me." On the drive home, we didn't play music. We didn't need. To fill the space, her hand rested on my leg. My thumb traced lazy circles on her skin, and every few minutes we'd glance at each other, exchanging small smiles that spoke louder than anything else could. When we pulled into her driveway, she turned to me and asked, "Are you happy?" I didn't hesitate. "Yeah, I am." She nodded slowly, as if she'd needed to hear it out loud. "I'm scared," she confessed, "of what happens if this ends, of how hard it might be if something changes." I looked at her and said, "Then let's not focus on what could end. Let's just keep building what's beginning." Eyes welled up, not with sadness, but with relief. That night, we didn't say goodbye. We just said, "See you tomorrow," like it was already understood that tomorrow belonged to us too. As I drove home under the quiet stars, I realized something I hadn't been able to put into words until then. This wasn't just a story about painting a kitchen. It was about painting over the years of isolation and self-doubt with new colors, laughter, honesty, the boldness of trying again. And somehow, we had both become each other's fresh coat. The days following the mural project unfolded with a sense of lightness neither of us had expected. It wasn't that anything monumental happened, but rather the way small moments began to stitch themselves into something meaningful. Nadine started to call me in the mornings, not for any particular reason, just to say good morning or ask what I had for breakfast. Sometimes she'd leave little messages on sticky notes taped to the front door if she knew I'd be coming by. Things like "Coffee's hot" or "Hope you slept well." They were small gestures, yes, but they carried the warmth of someone making space for you in their world, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. One afternoon, she asked if I could help her rearrange the furniture in her living room. She said she was craving change, something that felt new without being drastic. I arrived to find her rolling up area rugs and pulling the cushions off the couch. Barefoot and determined, her hair tied up with a red bandana like she was ready to take on the world. We moved the couch to the opposite wall, shifted the bookshelf near the window, and swapped some old framed photos for pieces she hadn't displayed in years. As we worked, she told me the stories behind the things she'd kept hidden, photos from her college days, a sketch her daughter had drawn during a camping trip, a little ceramic cat she'd bought during a solo trip to Barcelona. The more we unearthed, the more it felt like I was being welcomed deeper into her personal history, layer by layer. She wasn't just showing me her home, she was showing me herself, flaws and all, and trusting that I wouldn't turn away. And I didn't. If anything, I felt more anchored to her the more I learned. There was a quiet courage in the way she let herself be seen, in the way she didn't try to polish the rough edges or explain away her mistakes. She just put them out there, raw and unfiltered, like brushstrokes on a canvas that only made the painting richer. Later that evening, as we sat on the floor with glasses of wine and music playing softly in the background, she turned to me and said something I hadn't expected. "You know," she began, "for a long time, I thought the best parts of my life had already passed. That everything from here on out would be a sort of quiet decline, but lately, I don't know. I feel like I'm waking up again. Like I'm allowed to feel things I'd boxed away." I reached out and took her hand, letting my thumb gently trace the lines of her palm. "You're not just allowed," I said. "You deserve every bit of it." She smiled, eyes glassy with emotion, and leaned her head against my shoulder. We sat like that for a long time, the kind of silence that only exists between two people who no longer need words to understand each other. Eventually, she spoke again, quieter this time. "I haven't felt this young in 15 years, she whispered. And it wasn't just the phrase from the kitchen anymore, it was something she truly meant. She wasn't talking about youth in the physical sense, but the kind that lives in your heart when you feel hopeful again. The kind that allows you to take risks, to laugh too loudly, to trust, to love. That night, she asked me to stay again. With a question, but with an open door and an extra pillow already on the couch, I didn't hesitate. We stayed up late watching old movies, our feet tangled beneath the blanket, the flicker of the screen casting soft shadows across her living room. At one point, she fell asleep with her hand resting on my chest, her breath sinking with mine, and in that moment, I knew this wasn't fleeting. Whatever this was between us, it had roots now. It had survived the awkward silences, the buried grief, the gentle unfolding of two people who had lived long enough to know how rare it is to be understood. The next morning, Nadine surprised me with something that made my heart catch in my throat. She'd found an old photo of herself in her late 20s, standing in front of her first apartment, paintbrush in hand, beaming at the camera. "This was the last time I painted something just for myself," she said. Then she handed me a brand new canvas and a small set of acrylics. "I want us to do one together. A painting, I mean. No plan, no pressure. It's just something that captures this time. Even if we don't finish it, I want to start it." So that's what we did. We set the canvas up in her sunroom, poured out a mix of colors onto a palette, and started painting. Not a scene, not a portrait, just feelings brushstroke by brushstroke. She added warm reds and oranges. I added deep blues and greens. It wasn't about making it beautiful. It was about making it ours. About putting something on a canvas that would hold this season of our lives long after it passed. We laughed when our colors bled into each other, creating muddy purples and unexpected shapes, but neither of us tried to fix it. We just kept going, and maybe that was the point. That even when things get messy, when colors don't turn out like you expect, you keep painting anyway. You keep showing up. You keep believing that something beautiful can come out of it. As the afternoon lights streamed through the windows, catching the glint of the wet paint and dancing across Nadine's face, I realized that I wasn't just falling for her. I was falling into a life I hadn't imagined for myself. One that was slower, fuller, more deliberate. A life made not of grand gestures, but of quiet mornings, shared meals, long drives, and unfinished paintings. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the next big thing, I felt like I was already in it. Over. The following days, the painting became something of a ritual for us. Each morning after coffee and conversation, Nadine and I would spend 20 or 30 minutes adding new strokes to our canvas. Sometimes we said a lot during that time. Other days we barely spoke at all. But the silence was never uncomfortable. It was a silence of shared presence, of two people gently orbiting the same moment. The painting itself was abstract and imperfect, an ever-growing expression of our memories, our jokes, our hesitations, our healing. It didn't matter what it looked like to anyone else. To us, it was a map, and we both knew the territory it was charting. One morning, Nadine mentioned that her daughter was coming to visit in a few days. I'd heard about her in small snippets. Clara, early 30s, lived out of state, worked. In nonprofit advocacy, strong-willed like her mother, but more private, Nadine seemed both excited and anxious about the visit. She hasn't seen me like this in a long time, she admitted. Not just happy, open. I asked if she wanted me to be around, and she hesitated. Be not at first, she said. No, I want to ease her into it. She worries, especially since her father and I divorced. She's protective, I understood. Relationships between mothers and daughters carried their own delicate weight, especially when life had shaped and reshaped them so many times. I spent that afternoon finishing up a few paint touch-ups in Nadine's kitchen. The original reason I'd come into her life in the first place. The pale green walls gleamed softly in the afternoon sun, a far cry from the dull beige they had been before. It was strange to think how much had changed in such a short time, not just in the kitchen, but in both of us. When Clara arrived 2 days later, I made myself scarce. Nadine had texted me early that morning, a simple message that read, "Today's the day, wish me luck." I replied with, "She's going to see what I see." That night Nadine called me after Clara had gone to bed. She asked if I was seeing someone, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. I told her yes, but that it's not what she might think. I told her I'm seeing someone who makes me feel alive again. I didn't say anything for a moment, just let her words settle in. Then I told her that she made me feel the same way. The next morning I met Clara for the first time. Nadine had invited me over for brunch, casual and unforced. Clara was polite, but cautious, her eyes sharp with questions she hadn't voiced yet. She was warm with her mother, though attentive in the way grown children are when they've spent time apart. I could see how much they loved each other, even through the tension. Over scrambled eggs and fruit salad, Clara finally asked me how I'd met her mom. I explained the kitchen job, how it started as just a task and became something far more unexpected. She listened carefully, measuring my words, but something softened in her expression when I talked about the mural and the painting and the breakfasts we'd shared. Later, as Nadine stepped out to answer a phone call, Clara pulled me aside. "She's different," she said. "Lighter." "I haven't seen her this way in years," I nodded. "She's rediscovering parts of herself. I'm just lucky to witness it." Clara studied me for a moment longer, then said quietly, "Just don't take it for granted. She's been through more than she ever tells anyone." I told her I knew, and I meant it. That evening, after Clara left to catch her flight, Nadine and I sat on the porch watching the sky turn from gold to lavender. She leaned her head against my shoulder and said, "She liked you, I could tell." I smiled. "She loves you. That's what matters." Nadine nodded and exhaled deeply, as if a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying had finally been released. The next day, we returned to our painting. It was nearly complete now, a swirl of bold lines and soft curves, a record of everything we hadn't known how to say. Nadine stood back and looked at it for a long time. "I think we should sign it," she said, "together." We dipped our brushes and wrote our initials in the bottom right corner, side by side. NW plus MH. It felt symbolic, but not possessive. It's like leaving footprints in wet cement evidence that we'd been here, that we'd made something together. That afternoon, I cooked for her for the first time. Nothing fancy, just pasta, garlic bread, and a salad, but the act of preparing something for her felt intimate in its own way. She sat at the kitchen table, watching me move through her space. With ease, occasionally tossing out cooking tips or teasing me when I dropped a spoon. We ate by candlelight, laughing between bites. the room filled with the scent of roasted tomatoes and the sound of music drifting from her Bluetooth speaker. After we cleaned up, she led me outside to the backyard. She had strung up fairy lights. Around the fence, their glow soft and golden. "I wanted to show you this," she said. "It used to feel empty out here. Now it feels like part of something." We sat in lawn chairs under the stars, a blanket across our laps, and just listened to the cicadas. The breeze, the hush of the world settling down, and it was in that moment, with her hand in mine and the night wrapped around us, that I realized we weren't rushing toward anything. We were simply allowing life to unfold. Slowly, gently, honestly, and sometimes. That's the bravest way to love. The final few weeks of summer came with the kind of stillness that makes you notice every shift. In the light, every quiet ripple in the air, Nadine and I settled into a rhythm that felt natural, but never dull each day, holding its own kind of intimacy. Whether it was sharing a slow morning over toast and jam, or walking through the local farmer's market, fingers loosely interlaced, just enough contact to say I'm here without needing to say it out loud, people began to notice us neighbors, shop owners, even the couple who ran the tiny second-hand bookstore where Nadine liked to browse the poetry section. Most were kind, curious, smiling in that knowing way. But once in a while, we got stares. I knew why. There was an unspoken commentary that sometimes surrounded a relationship like ours, quiet. Middle-aged, built not on flash, but on foundation. Some found it unusual. Others just didn't understand. We didn't owe them an explanation. We were writing our own story, day by day. One afternoon, we returned to the canvas in the sunroom. It had been finished for over a week, but Nadine kept it up on the easel anyway, as if taking it down would somehow break the spell. I found her sitting in front of it, chin resting in her palm, eyes distant. When I asked what she was thinking, she said, "It's funny how you can paint something without knowing exactly what it means, and then later, it becomes clear." I nodded and pulled up a chair beside her. "What do you see now?" She smiled faintly. "Resilience and hope, and the mess that becomes beautiful when you stop trying to control it." That evening, we boxed the canvas, carefully, and stored it in her attic with the intention of framing it one day, maybe even hanging it in her hallway. As we came down the ladder, dust clinging to our clothes, she looked at me and said, "I think that painting changed me." I told her it had changed me too, because it wasn't just about color or texture, it was a mirror, and what it reflected was a woman rediscovering herself and a man quietly finding his place beside her. Without taking anything away, a few days later, Nadine invited me to a small dinner party her friend Marie was hosting. It was an older crowd, mostly longtime friends from the community. And I could sense that this was important to her, that bringing me into this circle meant more than just casual introduction. She wore a deep blue dress that matched the dusk sky, her silver earrings catching the last rays of daylight as we walked up the garden path. I hadn't seen her glow quite like this before, not even during our mornings together. It was the glow of someone stepping into herself fully. With no hesitation, the evening was warm, the air filled with laughter, wine, and the hum of conversation layered over the clinking of cutlery. Marie raised a glass at one point and toasted. Two old friends, new beginnings, and everything in between. Nadine looked at me when she said it, her eyes shining. Later, when the night wound down and we were sitting in Marie's backyard under string lights, one of the guests asked how long we'd been together. Nadine answered first, her voice calm but sure. "Not long by most standards," she said. "But time has nothing to do with depth that silenced any doubts." No one questioned us after that. When we got back to her house, we stood at her doorstep longer than usual, neither of us quite ready to call it a night. She looked at me and said, "You know, I think this is the first time in years I've felt seen, like really seen." I stepped closer and replied, "It's because you stopped hiding." She let out a quiet laugh and touched my cheek. "I didn't stop hiding. I just found someone who made it feel safe not to. At night." Stayed again, but it wasn't about sleeping over anymore. It was about being home the next morning. As I was putting on my shoes near the front door, she asked if I could help her with one last project, a forgotten garden bench in the backyard, its paint peeling and wood slightly warped. I said yes, of course I would. So we spent the afternoon sanding it down, side by side, just like when we first worked on her kitchen. She chose a bold teal color this time, laughing that she felt brave enough for something a little loud. We painted in comfortable silence, occasionally bumping elbows, and when we were done, the bench gleamed with new life. She sat down, patted the space beside her, and said, "This feels like something we built, not just something we fixed." We sat there for a long time, watching the late sun melt into the treetops. And just before the sky turned fully dark, she whispered, "I'm not afraid of time passing anymore, not if I get to feel like this." I squeezed her hand and whispered, "Back then, let's not waste a second." And that's the thing about unexpected beginnings. They rarely come with fireworks or grand declarations. Sometimes they arrive as a kitchen that needs painting, a conversation over coffee, a shared silence in front of a canvas. And sometimes they unfold into something steady, something healing, something that changes how you see yourself and what love can look like. Nadine wasn't just a woman rediscovering herself. She was a reminder that it's never too late to start again, never too late to feel young, not in years, but in spirit. And as for me, I hadn't just painted a kitchen. I had stepped into a life I hadn't realized I was missing, a life filled with warmth, depth, and the kind of love that grows not with speed, but with care. We were two people, a little weathered by life, learning to live in full color again. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.